Welcome to Just Fantasy Baseball. We are discussing some of the great written content of our site. I'm Ryan Finkelstein, managing editor at justbaseball.com. I have Joe Rowan, one of our writers here. And you did a really awesome piece about Oneil Cruz and Elly De La Cruz and why everyone is drafting the wrong Cruz in fantasy. Talk a lot about hype. Where are people completely missing the boat on, for one, drafting Elly as high as they are, and then we'll get into why Oneil Cruz is the real value here.
Yeah, so I think it's just a simple bias or simple reasoning of, recency bias. Recency bias is kind of a funny thing. I talked about in the article, people just forgot about O'Neill. It's a bummer last year when, he just went down against the White Sox that game, fractured his ankle, and I was bummed because I had him on one of my dynasty teams. So that was a bummer for sure, but he's back and he's back with a vengeance. You guys have all seen what he's doing in spring training so far. It's kind of funny. He was going later in drafts at the beginning of the draft season, and he wasn't going all that high. He was going around probably 100, like a average draft position of 100, and ever since he's hit these 7 home runs in spring training, he's gone up even more, and he's around, like, 50, 60 range, and I honestly believe it's kinda funny because like, that just proves that the recency bias is true, like, they kinda just totally forgot, and then I was like, "Oh, yeah, he still exists."
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, Elly is going even higher, and I do think that's a mistake. He's going right around, like, pick 30, right later second round, early third round. I think that's a bit of a mistake because the strikeout rate has still been pretty apparent in spring training. Whereas, you see O'Neill and his strikeout rate has improved in the brief stint that he had in 2022 when he played his 87 games. He had 17 homers and 10 steals, and his strikeout rate was improved back then from years past and years in the minors too. So the range that he's going, let's just talk about that a little bit. His ADP. So, he's O'Neill, he's going right around, pick 60, 70, right around there. He's in with guys, kind of like Gleyber Torres, Xander Bogaerts, Nick Castellanos, George Springer. I kind of call this the trapdoor range. It's because the guy's upside, it's not too high. High floors, but not very high ceilings. O'Neill, out of all of them, has the highest ceiling of them all. And I'd rather take the price of O'Neill around 70 than Elly at 30. When essentially, both are big time players, a lot of hype, but they come with a little bit of risk. So, yeah, when you're doing that, you want to invest later in the draft.
Yeah, you look at Oneil Cruz, and it's a 25-year-old shortstop who's going to be in the lineup every single day, who's got the power, as we've seen this spring, 7 home runs, to be able to be a 30 home run guy potentially. I mean, if he's getting regular playing time, which he will be, and it's also playing in the Central, and a lot of good ballparks in the NL Central. Obviously, they don't play in division as much as they used to, where you'd be sure to get the 19 games at Great American Small Park and everything else. But still, you're going to play in a pretty good ballpark to hit as well at PNC. It's not quite Cincy, but it's still a nice hitter's park.
Hmm.
He's going to be able to put up numbers. And obviously, Elly does play in Cincy, but like you said, I mean, the strikeouts can be pretty alarming so far in spring. I mean, it's spring training, but still, 21 strikeouts and 50 at bats. It's definitely a pretty high rate. And last year we saw him strike out 144 times in 98 games, so just under 400 at bats. So you're going to get those strikeouts with Elly, and I do agree. There is a wide range of outcomes for both, but I think Elly De La Cruz, there is a little more volatility there. We know he's going to play. We know that he's going to be in the middle of a good lineup, but at the same time, there's a lot of risk. You're looking at the risk on both of these guys. What concerns you the most here about these two young shortstops?
Yeah, so just to start out first, Elly's risk. like you said, he did strike out 144 times last year. Once the league started figuring him out a little bit, it was downhill, and he just plummeted from there. August and September, whenever I would turn on the game, I get the Cincy channel here, and it just wasn't good. I talked about in my article, he stepped in there at the beginning when he got called up, and he was like, man, he was looking like the eye of the tiger. But ever since they found the holes in his swing, he didn't really make adjustments. So that's kind of really my main fear with him. One thing I will say for Elly, he could get more steals than Oneil. That's really the only area I see him outperforming him in, just because his sprint speed is top of the league, and O'Neill's is it's top two, but it's more of like the 85th percentile, and Elly's like right at the 99. So and what the thing is though with that, the base running rules, you can find steals in the waiver wire in your fantasy leagues. You don't need to necessarily invest that high and pick 35. That's just too much to handle for me for Elly. But one of the main reasons I kind of like Oneil too is a lot about what we already talked about. He's going to be hitting leadoff. Elly, he is. Last year we saw him hit six and kind of in the middle of the lineup or later in the lineup. So again, there's that idea of turning simple chance into solid production, and he's hitting in front of guys with a lot of potential. Brian Hayes, Henry Davis. We've seen what he's done in spring training. Brian Reynolds, he's always there. So honestly, with Oneil, I just see his floor as being 30-20, with a respectable average too. I could see him being at least 250, where I see Elly kind of being right around 220.
That's huge, and it's of course relative to that average draft position. Where if you were just looking at these two guys, if they were getting picked one after another, well, then maybe you could have more of that argument of, all right, Elly's got similar power to Oneil. Maybe they both end up tapping into and hitting the 30 home runs, but Elly's going to steal twice as many bases. Now, when you're comparing it, though, to where these guys are getting drafted, it definitely gets a lot more skewed to why aren't people just waiting on Oneil instead of drafting Elly early? Obviously, Elly is one of the most marketable stars in the game. I think that always is going to pull the ADP up on some of these guys where the casual fans are just going to grab them, but they're making a mistake. And well, who else is around that range for Elly right now, as far as that 30 range, like you said, kind of second round, third round? Who else could you be getting at that pick and then wait on Oneil a couple picks later?
Yeah, so you could be getting like very consistent hitters and guys with a lot of production. You could be getting Manny Machado. And I talked about, go and look at Manny Machado's baseball reference page. He's quietly, I know he gets a lot of, sometimes crap for the way he behaves or what he says, but he is quietly one of the most productive third basemen in the whole league. And I mean, at that point, Elly has third base eligibility. You might as well just invest in Machado and then go for Oneil later. Or if you're looking for pitching at that point, I usually draft hitting before pitching. But if you are at that point, right around early third round, a guy like Pablo Lopez, one of the best starting pitchers out there, he's right there too. So yeah, that ADP for him and the risk that comes with him is just too much for me, and I'd rather wait for Oneil 4 rounds later.
Obviously, you want to draft for upside when you can, but drafting for upside that early in the draft, there's definitely a lot of risk there
Yeah.
where you could be getting, like you mentioned, some really consistent fantasy performers. Meanwhile, Oneil Cruz in his range, you're still getting that upside, but the risk isn't hurting you as much because it's a couple picks later down in the draft there.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Yeah. And honestly, especially if you're playing in a dynasty league, I see him as being, in the future, a 40-40 guy. I included a little link to Twitter in the article, and if you think about it, he's only one of a handful of guys that could get to 40-40. If you think about Elly, I don't think he has the 40 homer potential, but Oneil definitely has the 40 homer potential, and he can steal that many too, being at the top of the lineup. So I just think his floor, especially this year, at least 30-20. I actually saw this guy back in 2021. I saw Oneil in Indy. He played for the AAA Indians, Pittsburgh's affiliate, and I wasn't really aware of him, and I saw him walk on the field, and I was like, "Who is that?" Because I was like, and I had no idea it was Oneil Cruz, and I get the hype now because he is a beast, and he's definitely going to help you for sure.
That's what 6'7" will do to you. I know
Yeah.
I'm obviously people see the Mets stuff in my background here. I went over in might have been 20, I think it was 2022 actually. And I went to Binghamton. So at the time, Francisco Alvarez, Brett Beatty, Mark Vientos, they were all there as well. Actually, Vientos was in AAA, but Ronnie Mauricio was there as well. And I had been just crushing Mauricio on my podcast for years. Just the alarming strikeout rates, just all of the concerns that I had with his profile. And then I get to see him in person, and he's this huge dude, crazy athlete, and you're just like, wow. Like
Yeah.
it's one of those things where you look at the guy and you're like, all right, if we just lined everyone up on the foul line and you had to pick who the best player is without knowing anything, I'd point to Ronnie Mauricio. And I think Oneil, really both of them, Oneil and Elly, have that. But yeah, if you're in person, you see Oneil Cruz at his basketball height of 6'7",
Yeah.
he'll wow you. And then look, he has all the potential in the world to have a really monster season. My last kind of question on these two guys is ballpark and lineup. Like we mentioned, Elly's playing in one of the best ballparks to hit in baseball. I will say that lineup is definitely better, although it has
Hmm.
taken a couple hits recently. Noelvi Marte suspension, Matt McLean getting hurt to start the year. Overall, though, how do you kind of let that factor into the equation here on where these guys are playing and who they're playing with?
Yeah. So obviously, like we just said, and like I mentioned before, obviously the Reds are a better offensive team than the Pirates. Though the Pirates, like mentioned earlier, they're a little slept on. Their top half of the lineup is really going to give Oneil a great chance to be driven in with some of the guys behind him. And again, going back to that idea of, chance into production, I think you can really look at that with Oneil, and O'Neill's going to get more at bats than Elly. You don't really realize that Elly did hit in the 6 hole, and with all the injuries, he might move up in the Cincinnati lineup, but at the same time, Elly still being 22. That's another thing about their age. He's still 22, and O'Neill's 25. 25. Once some of the Cincinnati players do come back from their injury, and Noelvi comes back from a suspension, the, if if Elly struggles a lot like he did last year, and if he looks like August and September Elly, he could get sent down. Like that's not out of the realm of possibility. It's not. And a lot of people, if you're spending a 30th or a third round pick on Elly, and then your third round pick gets sent down, it's bad news for your team. So I definitely think the Pittsburgh lineup is very slept on, especially being in Central. It's not that tough. It's anyone's division, especially this year. So yeah, invest definitely in Oneil and the Pirates lineup for sure.
Yeah, you mentioned getting sent down, and it's one of those things where they're going to give Elly every opportunity to stay
Hmm.
on the roster, and it's I would say most likely maybe 95% chance to be with the big league team the whole year. But again, like you mentioned, you're drafting someone that high, and if
Yeah.
there's even that smallest risk
Hmm.
that your high draft pick could one have a really rough season, but also so rough that he ends up out of the lineup completely. I mean, that could be really devastating for your team. Like you mentioned, Oneil Cruz, even though he is coming off a lost season, he is right in his prime at 25 years old and should be able to have a ton of production this year. So I will leave the link to Joe's article in the episode descriptions. You can read all the great work he put into this. Oneil Cruz over Elly De La Cruz. I think that's the way a lot of people should be going right now, as everyone's getting those fantasy drafts in before opening day. We will have coverage throughout the season of everything going on in fantasy baseball. So make sure you hit that subscribe button on the YouTube channel. Check out the podcast with Vince and Rami. And we'll be back with more videos breaking down Joe's work and our other writers here on the Just Fantasy Baseball YouTube channel.